Spirit of Speed 1937 is a racing game released in 2000 for the Sega Dreamcast console depicting racing in 1937, as the title suggests. Although the game itself isn't anything noteworthy on its own merits, it does have some historical significance, or at the very least is an answer to a trivia question nobody will ever ask you. For you see, Spirit of Speed 1937 is the final game ever to be published, shall we say, by LJN, maker of toys. Of course, LJN as a brand or as an alternative label of parent company Acclaim Entertainment had long since been dead and buried for several years prior, and apparently only makes an appearance on this game because supposedly Acclaim knew of the game's poor quality, and thus the Rainbow of Death makes its final appearance on a 2000 video game released for the Sega Dreamcast. And true to popular LJN lore, Spirit of Speed 1937 is not a particularly good game. And I'm not the kind of person that has a tendency to go, "Durr, it's by LJN, therefore it sucks, durr." No, I've played a number of LJN published games. I've reviewed a couple of them actually. I've enjoyed some of them. I thought some of them were pretty decent for the most part. So I'm not a firm believer in the urban myth that everything LJN touches turns to shite. But at the same time, there is a general recognition that quality control is not one of LJN's strong points. And it definitely shows here. The whole gimmick behind Spirit of Speed is that it's a depiction of racing in the 1930s with old-timey music and old-timey cars with loud engines. As such, the game is rather slow. It's not exactly fast and furious, and there's no need for speed in here, or whatever ridiculously stupid car cliche you want to toss in there, but the concept is kind of sound. And on the surface at least, you have a rather modest selection of game modes, cars, and tracks to choose from. Whether it be a quick race or a career run at championship glory, you know you're in for one hell of a treat to experience what racing was like in the 1930s. Unfortunately, Spirit of Speed on the Dreamcast is probably not the best representation of that era of racing. In fact, Spirit of Speed on the Dreamcast is at best a pretty dull and lifeless gaming experience, and at worst, perhaps the most mind-numbing clunker I've ever played. Let me put it this way. If it takes a minute and a half to load a simple main menu that isn't all that extravagant or complex in its presentation, that's probably a sure sign that things aren't going to be pretty from here on out. Then again, loading times are probably the least of this game's woes. For the most part, Spirit of Speed's a standard racing game where you race a number of laps on a track in order to claim first place. There's pit stops that you could take in order to fix up your car and keep yourself in the race, whether it's to refuel or to fix your tires, whatever the case may be. And most of all, one fatal mistake can make a race near impossible to win. However, while in most racing games you always have a chance to snatch victory from near defeat, with Spirit of Speed, you're pretty much screwed the minute you start bumping into walls, because the car you drive is so slow and clunky that it refuses to win and would rather do stupid auto tricks or whatever the case may be. And the sad part is that even the so-called crashes are uninspired. You're always going to spin around in circles, and sometimes most of the fun comes out of how many times your spinning vehicle will crash into walls and severely hinder your progress. I can't even recall if these cars ever flew off the ground here, because some of the more intense crashes would certainly call for such a thing, but I guess these things were built like tanks and aren't as cheap and flimsy as today's cars. Which is a shame, because I would rather have a car that if I crash into a wall exploded to a million pieces than a car that just spun around whenever you crashed into a wall or something. I lost my train of thought there. That's what this game does. Control is something of an anomaly in Spirit of Speed. That is to say, Control somehow manages to be both extremely stiff and sensitive at the same time. Cars handled like heavy machines with slow turns should be easy to manage, but pointing the stick too hard at a direction will cause you to temporarily lose control, and trying to get the car back on track is a bit of a chore that results in failure and hitting a wall to bear witness to another one of them wacky spins. It's tolerable to a point if you're doing a practice race and driving a straight line, but trying to actually race against other opponents with these controls is almost a miracle never to happen. In terms of the overall presentation, Spirit of Speed looks fairly average as far as PlayStation quality graphics go. Aside from the simplistic looking main menu, the actual racetracks and vehicles themselves aren't all that impressive looking. In fact, the majority of the cars in this game might have different names and minor aesthetical differences, but otherwise look fairly similar to each other, and I believe they race the same way as well. The tracks themselves are also dull and lifeless, and most importantly, there's no real sense of speed to be found in this game. Even if you're not racing super fast cars capable of going 500 miles an hour, at the very least there should be that feeling that these racing machines are fast for their time. But the racing ultimately feels slow and sluggish thanks to a rather low frame rate. Hell, I might have even noticed a bit of clipping on a couple occasions here and there. It's rather sad, but on the bright side, for a PlayStation game the models are rather sharp looking, no ragged lines, it's clean, but ultimately the whole game in general looks very boring. What? Yeah, it's actually below average by PlayStation standards. Oh, this is a Dreamcast game. Oh. Right. Yeah. As far as sound goes, well, I like the opening movie's old-timey music. Sounded like something that would come from that period of time. Would have loved to have heard more of that kind of old-timey music throughout the rest of the game, but alas, it's not to be. Instead, you get old-timey engine noise and stock car crash sounds, and yeah, this is almost starting to remind me of that Big Rigs game that I touched last year. Load times, uninspired racing, cheapo sound effects. But Spirit of Speed is at the very least a complete video game, thus making it yards better than Big Rigs. At the end of the day, however, Spirit of Speed 1937 is a game that lacks quality control, enjoyment, and anything that could be considered worthwhile. The concept itself is not bad, and I wouldn't mind seeing some other developer take a crack at it, but the execution in Spirit of Speed is rather flawed. It's a game that does very little to inspire a sense of excitement or enjoyment. At best, it's a game of below average quality, at worst it's mind-numbingly boring, and its existence is somewhat confounding to most people. If you have a Dreamcast and you can find a copy for cheap, I'd be weary about this one even then. The novelty of having a copy of the last LJN branded video game is pretty much the only reason to even consider picking up Spirit of Speed. If you're looking for a good racing game, then this is not one you should be considering.